Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
Okay, so I want to set the stage here. We're at the post-conference retreat for High Desert Human Design 2023, and we've done this 2 years before. And what we typically do is we go camping, and during the camping we actually look at some of the deeper questions. The questions of, why are we here? Why did we go to the conference? Why are we incarnated in form? Why are we even having these conversations? Why are we talking to each other? What does it mean, really? I mean, these are the first fundamental questions that humans asked. The wonderment at our place in the cosmos. And so today I'd like to start with that, and I'd like to set the stage of where we are. We're somewhere in between the Big Bang and the Eron, the beginning and the end. For those not familiar with the Eron, that was a form that was given to Ra during his encounter with the voice. And that form was very interesting. It had a lot of differences from our form. For one thing, it doesn't die. And so it's interesting that we actually are moving toward a form that will not have the incarnational process, that will not continue to incarnate, reincarnate, and so on. And so that raises the question of why we reincarnate, why we are on this process of movement from life to life to life. So starting with the Big Bang, this is the bond in the two crystals of consciousness that collided and shattered and initiated the expanding universe, or biverse, as we call it in human design. And over time, more and more complex life forms emerged. We started with single-cell organisms, and we moved forward and so on. And so there's a development of the form to house consciousness. These crystals of consciousness are not themselves conscious. They are filters of neutrinos. But the form that they enter into houses them and hooks them into the hardware, so to speak, that allows consciousness to emerge. And so we have the Big Bang as the beginning of everything, really, where it all started. And then we have the Eron as where we're all headed. And that's as far as Ra went. When he was asked what's after the Eron, or how is the, what is that for? He said that is, as they would say in the Middle Ages, the ring past not. The ring past not is kind of beyond that, we do not know. But what he was shown was that the universe, the cosmos, as he called it, the biverse, is an unborn living entity that actually will perhaps someday be born. I mean, that's that ring past not. We don't really know. I mean, if it's unborn, it would imply that it is to be born. And actually, at our stage in the evolutionary life of the cosmos, we are actually waiting for the prime personality crystal to enter, in some sense. It's an interesting concept. But as far as we are concerned in human design, we can see that our particular moment in the evolution of this massive cosmos of which we are a part of has to do with the incarnative process and has to do with the development of self-reflected consciousness. Now there's a man named Ray Brassier, and he wrote a book called Nihil Unbound, Enlightenment and Extinction. And in that book, he makes a very interesting philosophical argument that, as we've known for many years in studies of linguistics and studies of language and different areas of philosophy and critical theory, that signification is a retroactive process. What that means is that things become significant to us. We may not know the significance of the stop sign. We learn to drive. Suddenly, oh, I see, it means stop. That what has already occurred is retroactively reinscribed and given new significance. Every time something happens, every time we learn something, that learning changes what came before and reinscribes that with new significance. Now, because of this, Ray Brassiere makes an interesting claim. He says, the eventual heat death of the universe, which is a fact, we know that that will happen, that it will die out, it will end up dark in some sense, or at least it will run down. I guess our equivalent in human design would be the end of the Earth at the end of this round. But in his case, he's talking about the heat death of the entire cosmos. And what he says is, because it'll all eventually end up like that, that will retroactively reinscribe everything that came before it to have been meaningless, to have not made a difference at all. What's the difference? What's the difference? What happens if it's retroactively all going to have been moot? It's not like anything we're building can be saved. All castles are sand castles. And so he is part of a neo-rationalist movement that is essentially the newest form of eliminative materialism, a form of materialism that says the only reality is the atomic, which is perhaps why he talks about the universe and not the biverse. When we refer to our cosmos as the biverse, what we're doing is we're actually understanding it as not only the atomic reality, Einstein's relativity, things like that, we're also understanding the dimensions of base. And in the next talk, we'll go into those dimensions. But for now, it's enough to say that there's an atomic and a non-atomic universe. Two universes, you could say. Or one biverse that is something like a dual substance. That there's the atomic substance and the non-atomic substance, which we call dark matter and dark energy. And the neutrino is what interacts between the two. It's the carrier and transmitter of information between the two. But for Brassiere, he's someone who, and I've actually engaged with him online. He doesn't engage too much, but he'll sometimes reply and so on. And he's a materialist in the sense that he is looking at atomic matter and saying because the atomic matter will eventually be destroyed or will be rendered, completely dark in some sense, everything will become icy. He sees an icy death for all of us, right? Even if reincarnation is real, we'll eventually reincarnate into an icy world where all of the heat has wound down, has burned out, that all the stars are burning fuel and there's no way to refuel them. All the fuel was there in the Big Bang and it just burns down. All of the energy just dissipates. And so in this icy death that he sees for all of us, he sees the retroactive reinscription of everything that came before as meaningless. Because how could it be meaningful if it's all going to be destroyed and nothing will be left? And if the future reinscribes the past, then we can look to the farthest point in the future to find the ultimate meaning of what occurred in the past. Now here's a man named Quentin Melissu, and I'm much more of a Melissuian than I am a Brassierian in these matters. Quentin Melissu is a wonderful book called After Finitude, an essay on the necessity of contingency. And he has some wonderful thought experiments in this. And one of his thought experiments is he agrees with Brassiere and with Lacan and all of these students of critical theory that meaning is retroactive reinscription of what came before it, and that an event that brings new meaning renders previous events in a new light. But he has his own interesting question. He says, well, what if the Christians are right? What if there is an eternal afterlife, and after you die, there you are in this eternal life? That itself would render all meaning that came before in a new light. And what if at the end of the universe, after this heat death, after this nihil unbound, this unbound nihilism that leads to the ultimate destruction of everything, what if there is an after the end? Brassiere doesn't think far enough, and he doesn't think big enough. Every time he approaches something, Brassiere is drawing a circle around it, but he refuses to go to the great outdoors. This is what Quentin Melissu tells us. That this great outdoors of thought is beyond the atomic matter, that there's something else. And in fact, Melissu has a wonderful logical argument for this. Everything atomic, everything that we say exists, for Brassier, that's all there is. There is only existence. And everything that exists, Brassier identifies with the material world and so on, and that's just all it is. And so in that world, if all that is destroyed, then I guess it was meaningless all along, right? What is the meaning there if it's all going to be destroyed? But Melissu has a really beautiful logical twist here where he says, okay, I agree with Brassier. None of that is necessary for anything because, hey, if it were necessary, if a particular tree were necessary, and that tree is cut down, the world would end, right? There are certain peoples who believe they have to pray every day or the sun won't come up. If they stopped praying, the world would end, right? Well, that's not actually true. The world continues on. Although it does raise an interesting question when Ra mentioned that the personality crystal of Sirius actually incarnated in a yew tree. For those who know that little bit of trivia, that's an interesting one. Like, if you cut down that yew tree, what happens, But nevertheless, Melissu has this wonderful thought experiment. Nothing that exists is necessary. Therefore, what is necessary? What doesn't exist? What insists from the non-atomic? The structure within which the atomic matter, in other words, if nothing is necessary in our three spatial dimensions and our one time dimension, something beyond the three spatial dimensions and one time dimension is necessary. Because necessity, he has a logical proof for why there is necessity. I mean, we can't have one without the other. It's like if we realize nothing is necessary, that means that something else must be necessary. And I won't go into his proofs for that, but it's essentially, it goes back to the fact that in order to logically define something, you can either point at it or you can negate that pointing. So, for instance, this goes back to Deleuze and his work on the work of Henri Bergson, who states that order is necessarily real and it necessarily came first, because all we can do to describe chaos is point at order and apply a generalized function of negation. You can give no clear explanation of what order actually is, what chaos actually is, but you can point to order. One goes to the next, then chaos, you say, no, it's not that. It's not that. It's something that does not go in order. And so what this does is it allows us to come to first concepts, and it allows us to eliminate false composites. When we think chaos is something real, actually it's a false composite. All it is order with a generalized function of negation applied to it. The same can be said between the possible, or I guess the actual. What's actual is real, and then what's possible is an illusion made by pointing to the actual and saying not that. And the same is true with something and nothing. You cannot actually clearly define nothingness. You can only point at something and say, well, it's not any of this, something that's not here, right? So in any case, Melissu has this beautiful reversal of Brassier, where he agrees with Brassier that what comes after casts what came before in a new light. But rather than Brassier saying, well, we know that the heat death of the universe is an inevitability, that the fuel will run out and it will end in an icy death. And even if reincarnation is real, you're just going to reincarnate as, some parasite on an icy rock until even they don't have enough energy to survive anymore. He has this sort of negativistic, nihilistic thing in his Nihil Unbound. But Melissu says, well, let's think after that. At any point, something could happen that would retroactively reveal everything that came before to have actually been meaningful, some sort of afterlife. So this then gets to one of the core questions of human design, which is decision-making and indecision. It's kind of funny. I put that in there as a comment because I do want to talk a little bit about how that works. We're at a phase in the development of the building of the Ajna center of our entire cosmos, right? That's what our solar system is. That the sun is a special star. It has 3 crystals of consciousness rather than 2. It's in a very special place in our entire universe. So while the entire universe, biverse, cosmos may be conscious, it doesn't have self-reflected consciousness. And I'm not even saying the sun does or anything. Obviously, as I said earlier, we need the vessel, the actual brain system and the biological system to have that. But what that self-reflected consciousness does is it essentially gives us a different relationship to decision-making. And I just want to take this a moment as a side note that I find a lot of people in human design will be in a state of indecision that causes a tremendous amount of chaos and causes a lot of problems, and then they justify it by saying, well, you can't force me to make a decision or something like that. I'm not, emotionally clear. I don't know yet, and so on. And yeah, that's fine if you don't know, but the real question is really how you're navigating the Maya and how you're navigating that. It's like if you choose not to speak, you're still saying something. If you choose not to make a decision, you're still making a decision. Like decision is, not that we're making it, but that decision is made. If you want to get into no choice, I'm not deciding, but the decision is made, and lack of decision is still a decision in some sense. And so people kind of like to think that they can be in a state of indecision. Well, you can buy time. Sometimes you can buy time. Sometimes you can't, right? The decision is made. So an interesting side note there. But the way I see our current moment in evolution and what I want us to all consider is that we're at the moment where the bioform of the vessel, basically our life force, has found the evolution of the biology to such a level of complexity that we now have a different relationship to decision-making than the so-called lower life forms. And for that, I'm going to actually refer to Henri Bergson. Bergson coined the term zone of indetermination. He calls it a gap or a zone of indetermination. And what he basically says is if you start with insects or single-cell organisms, you work your way up. I mean, there's a slime mold that can solve a maze, right? We know it has consciousness. You give it food at the end of a maze, it'll find the shortest distance to get there. Then we go up through insects, and we see their kind of hive mind. And we go to fish, and well, there's schools of fish, but some of them go off on their own, and we start to see more differentiation in reptiles and birds and up to mammals. And what Bergson claims is that this zone of indetermination increases. It's something like the ability to subjectively hold a quantum state that could go one way or could go another. We can still reconcile this with no choice by seeing that both ways you go, everything self-corrects and is in a very complex self-healing network to make sure that things that must be done are done and so on, and that tendencies still occur. But nevertheless, there is this sort of quantum state that can collapse in different directions. And it increases with the complexity of the bioform all the way to our nine-centered being, which is the most complex, the top of the food chain, and the so-called lower life forms. I mean, this is a favorite bugaboo of the philosophers, where they love to attack the hubris of the human, saying that we're at the top of the food chain. And, oh, what tremendous hubris we have that we think we're the only self-reflected consciousness in the cosmos. Well, it's far more radical and terrifying that we actually are the only self-reflected consciousness in the cosmos. Sure, there are aliens, but they can only be experienced through encounter, the way one might experience an angel or a demon or a ghost. You get the idea. There are no aliens with self-reflected consciousness having conversations about us the way we have conversations. And it's actually something in contemporary philosophy circles that's quite common to try to dethrone the human from the top of the food chain and try to say, and I see this all as a metaphor for the dethroning of the personality, as it's basically there's a game of telephone and they're saying something that has some truth in it, and to redeem the truth from it, we have to realize what they're really saying is what we know in human design, which is that the personality doesn't control where the actual vehicle goes. All the personality can do is introduce a whole lot of resistance through trying to impose its indecision on the decision-making process of the vehicle, right? That's all the personality really does. It tries to impose indecision. Well, I don't know if I know this. I don't know about that. Well, I mean, yeah, I don't know this. I don't know that. It's like, yeah, if you're defined emotionally and you're unclear about something, that's no. But you can try to buy more and more and more time saying, well, I'm not sure, I'm not sure, I'm not sure, I'm not sure. And you can cause a whole lot of emotional chaos for everyone around you because the personality is resisting following what the form has already decided, which is no.
Or it's externalizing and projecting that indecision onto others.
Exactly, and creating a whole lot of, exactly. So there's a lot of conflict that comes from the lack of surrender, right? And that lack of surrender looks like indecision. It's like, where does decision making happen? In the form. Where does indecision happen? In the mind. Well, I'm not sure about this. Did I sign up for this? And so on, and then the it's like, we do have a choice. Our choice is to surrender to no choice. It's the only choice we have. Now, some disagree with that and say you have no choice whether you surrender to that or not as well. And I don't go that far because I think that at our particular moment in the evolution of consciousness, we are here to learn, and that learning is the changing of awareness. And so when Ra would laugh and people would say, I want to change. Will human design help me change? He'll say, no, it's not going to help you change. You can't change. Well, that's true. You can't change mechanically. But you can surrender to the mechanics. What is that? That's learning. That's how we develop wisdom. Now, it's not that you learn and then you now can suddenly make decisions. It's you learn and you can suddenly surrender to the decisions being made instead of imposing the indecision of the mind onto that decision-making process. But getting back to Bergson and the zone of indetermination, he essentially tells us that as we've become more and more complex, we have developed the ability, he tells us two things about this. We have developed the ability to resist habitual impulses and reactions, and we have developed the ability to appeal to past experience. And so in the first case, I want to mention something, which is that earlier today, I was quite snappy and reacted out of anger in an angry conversation. Some people use human design as an excuse to follow their body impulse at any point in time, and that's not what it is. That was the not self, in fact. Amplification, undefined emotional center, undefined ego. And if you have an undefined center and someone pushes your button and you react, what has happened is that zone of indetermination was not big enough. That gap was not big enough to be able to remain in the parasympathetic nervous system and to be able to contain that experience without reaction. So what instead happened is there was a reaction, right? And it's not following your design to follow your impulses when someone pushes your button and you react. It's following your design to maintain that zone of indetermination where you do not react when that button is pushed. A way of thinking of it would be if you tell a dog not to eat the food, it won't until it gets so hungry that it has to. And it'll feel guilty about it. It's not that they don't, sorry I ate the food. You come back, it's like, it knows it wasn't supposed to eat it, but it did because it was hungry. It tried to wait as long as it could, but that gap or zone of indetermination was not big enough to resist habitual reaction, impulse. Humans can go on hunger strike until they die. A human has a big enough gap or zone of indetermination to maintain that. Now, you might put it the other way and say, isn't that the mind controlling the body? And isn't that control of the body from the mind exactly what we are trying to eliminate with human design? That is, through surrender. And there is a point there as well, because it could be that they're so amplified and so triggered that they've mentally decided to have a hunger strike. And that hunger strike is going to be, right? But either way, we now can see that the human is a complex enough organism that we have certain key differences from the other life forms. And this is Christian Kerslake and Deleuze and the Unconscious. For Bergson and Genet, the human being is an organism that happens to have become complex enough to open up a zone of indetermination in its brain, which permits the suspension of habitual reaction and the appeal to past experience. This cerebral zone of indetermination becomes the gap or interval through which duration enters, proceeding to take charge of the organism, turning it inside out. Time surges into the brain, changing everything, so that now it is the brain which becomes shaped around an ever-accumulating ontological memory, rather than vice versa. Wherever interiorized duration arises, time pushes through and inverts the fabric of the universe, so that matter must now be taken as the envelope of temporal becoming, rather than time being dependent on matter. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze makes the Kantian point that a succession of instants does not constitute time any more than it causes it to disappear. It indicates only its constantly aborted moment of birth. Time is constituted only in the originary synthesis which operates on the repetition of instants. At the moment that the material universe inverts itself and interiorizes itself virtually, it, starting with the brain, becomes shaped around time, rather than vice versa. There is an ascent through the involution of virtuality to an entirely new order of validity, beyond the order of actual fact. Emphasis mine. The emergence of memory through the zone of indetermination opens up a process of interiorized differentiation, which proceeds to evolve in tension with the more generalizing tendencies of intelligence. And what I like about this is the idea that for the other life forms, they're essentially being molded by their environment. But that as we increase this gap through which time surges in some sense, we gain interiority, we gain self-reflected consciousness, and we begin to terraform and modify our environment. We are no longer sculpted by the environment, we sculpt the environment. And we gain an awareness of what we could call the decision-making processes of the biology, because we can now reflect on them. What we gain is the ability to pause time, and in this space of paused reflective time, like we're sharing here in this talk, we can add, we can remove, we can say, no, not this, yes, add that. And we essentially are sharing a paused space of reflection. And from that paused space of reflection, we can learn, and we can actually see and learn things and have epiphanies and have realizations. And that learning changes something, that the awareness itself acts, that our mechanics don't change, that we don't necessarily change in that sense, but that somehow the movement, the point of self-reflected consciousness is to learn. And so we're in this repetitive reincarnational cycle where we reincarnate again and again and again. And why is that? It's that each life feels permanent, but actually you mess up, you do something so bad you end up in jail the rest of your life. You have another chance next life not to mess up so bad. It's different from the Eron. The Eron doesn't have another chance next life. The Eron has one life. It's actually much scarier. We think, I wish I were immortal. Well, it's way more terrifying, because then you end up in jail for life. You're in jail for life, right? Not that the Erons will have jail, but that what we're doing here, we only have 1,300 years to go to school, to go to the school of decision-making, where our decisions are not permanent. Yes, they will always have happened, but we get another chance. I like Ra's quote, "No choice doesn't mean no chance." And there is something we've all seen over and over again of someone who's in a relationship and it ends up a certain way, and they initiate their way out of it and they're not a manifester, or they give away their power and stay in it if they are a manifester or something, or they're emotional and they don't wait for clarity, and they, we've seen again and again and again that they're given an opportunity to learn, that the awareness does not change, therefore the awareness does not act, therefore once they end that relationship, all the waveforms collapse in their tendencies through archetypal synchronic resonance to guarantee you meet somebody that will teach you the same lesson. To guarantee that those waveform collapses will occur in such a way to orchestrate through a divine orchestration for you to have that same experience. That's my understanding of no choice. Obviously, the story I think most of you have heard by now, that Friday, September 15th, was going to be the night that we were going to have an event at the apothecary, which ended up not happening. Well, what ended up happening? Some from our group went to the apothecary, met the person who was going to be at that event, brought her here, and we met her the exact same time, within an hour of when we would have met originally. It's like the waveform collapsed one way, so every other waveform had to reorganize quickly to then collapse to create a new avenue for that no choice to happen. It's Death in Samara, the great Somerset Maugham story, right? Where Death is startled because he sees somebody and he frightens the guy, and then the guy runs off to go to Samara, and then the shopkeeper who hired the guy or something says, Death, why did you scare this person? He says, well, he scared me. I was so surprised to see him here when I have an appointment with him tonight in Samara, right? I mean, that's no choice. It's like the waveform collapses one way, you take one avenue, right? This zone of indetermination, which kind of allows, I won't call it decisions to happen. I'll say there's no choice, but there is freedom, weirdly. And we'll get into that in base, because freedom is a keynote of base. And you know where it is? In the personality, in the illusion, right? So freedom is an illusion, but it's an illusion that operates. It's an illusion that works. You're in that relationship. You don't learn from it. You're getting another relationship the exact same way. You're in that job and you don't learn what you needed to learn there. The next job is going to be just like that. You did learn what you needed to learn. The next one will be different. No choice. It's still no choice, but the trajectory changes. It's no choice, but it's not no chance. We all are given these chances to learn, and we have 1,300 years to go of the chance to learn, because once we're the Eron, Ross said it's basically like they pair bond, and it's like locking face to face with somebody for the rest of eternity. Can you imagine staring into somebody's face? Yeah, you love them. Do you want to stare into their face for the next 100,000 years, right? And not being able to break that bond? I mean, all of the third lines here shiver, right? Because we're in this time where we can break the bond, even if only through death, sometimes, right? But we have death, we have the ability to come back and learn something new and try again. And if we didn't learn it this time, we might learn it the next time. And so what are we doing here in this interregnum between the Big Bang and the Eron, right? We're learning. We're becoming aware. We are self-reflected consciousness. We are the passenger that becomes aware that it doesn't have a choice, but it does have awareness. And it can either learn, or it can continue to impose its indecision as if it had a choice and introduce a whole lot of chaos and resistance, which merely delays the learning and pushes that further later in this life, maybe in the next life. It's like Ra's favorite line. He would look out at his audience and he said he wished he could walk through the audience with a samurai sword cutting off heads, saying, better luck next life. Well, because their awareness was not learning. It merely continued to impose its indecision, holding up the decision-making process that we have no choice in ultimately obeying. That's it. Thank you. So, appreciate you all, and we'll take a break. We will return a little bit later with base theory session 1. And I have a lot of interesting information to share for you. This was kind of the abstract side. We'll go into some of the logic. We are probably going to take about a half-hour break. So.
Okay. And basis after that?
Yes.
12:40.
Sounds good to me. Yeah, that's good. Thank you.